And good morning or afternoon. We are live. Congratulations. You made it through the week. Another week of amazing food safety, food quality, awesome products that we all enjoy every single day. Because of you and all that you do for food safety, you make it safe for us to do that. But our work goes unheralded. But that's not always the case because myself and Duncan, we are going to let you know today. Thank you. We really appreciate all that you do for food safety. If you're new to the Food
Solid
Safety
job,
Chat,
everyone.
welcome. Pull up a chair. And my name is Bryan Armentrout with the Food Leadership Group. And of course, this is Duncan Lacey with Food Industry Hub over in the UK. Duncan, how are you doing today?
Oh, yeah, just really well, thank you. And it's always a pleasure to feature on a chat.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if you're new to the chat, you're in for a treat because when Duncan is on the chat, we always have fantastic conversations. And one of the rules that I've always had relative to conferences or any type of an event that you're getting information from is if you just find out one new thing, one new piece of information that can help bring your game up to that next level, help build on your talent stack of the skills that you use every single day, it's worth it. So hopefully we're able to bring you some of that here today. So one of the things that we love to do on the chat, and I referenced this a little bit. Good morning, Steve. Good to see you. Is we like to always talk about where we're at in the world. And so I'm in Loveland, Colorado, here in the U.S. And what's fantastic about the chat is that it is international. I love Duncan when we see in the chat people from Africa and India, Asia, all over the world. People join us for the chat, which is absolutely the best thing. And where are you located at today, Duncan?
So I'm in the UK, and for anybody who knows England, it's the sort of Manchester region that I'm from.
Nice, nice. How's the weather looking for you today?
Grey and rainy, just as it is on almost every day here.
I find that hard to believe. Well, here in Colorado, this is so the weather in Colorado is not steady. I guess is probably the best way to put it. We had some decent snow here recently. It's pretty much all gone now. And today we have a high temperature, Duncan, of 63 F, so around 17 or so centigrade. So it's going to be a gorgeous day here today. But then, of course, this is just an anomaly, and we'll be dipping down to highs closer to 2 or 3 degrees C starting off tomorrow. So it's good timing for Friday here.
Yeah, comfortable.
Nice. Yeah. So Steve's in Silver Spring, Maryland, beautiful area. LinkedIn guest in North Carolina. Tim is home in Tennessee. That's great. So Tim's one of our road warriors here on the chat, and he always provides really cool updates on what he is up to out in his network. He was commenting, I believe it was this morning, Tim, on some of the changes with traveling here in the U.S. I don't know if you saw it over there, Duncan. There was a video of a couple of planes that were on the tarmac, and they ran into each other. So one plane was going to park, and another one was coming in, and a wing clipped the tail of the
You
other
know what it
plane.
is? Air traffic control just gets so preoccupied what happens in the air, they don't focus at all on what happens on the tarmac.
Yeah, it was interesting because the person that was filming it had commented on the little video and said it was like a slow motion disaster. You could just see it happening. It's like okay, yeah, and it happened. Good morning, Austin. Always good to see Austin here in the Denver area.
Hi, folks. And I need to apologise up front. I've had to join the chat from my mobile, so I can't see the comments coming up, but it's great to hear the familiar names. So hi, everybody.
Oh, that's thanks for reminding me of that. So I will make sure to pay special attention to the comments, everybody. And if you have questions for Duncan, which I'm sure we're going to have some really good feedback here today. Good morning, Corin. I'll make sure and relay those as well, because if you're new to the chat, so Corin, I don't think I've seen you in here before, so definitely welcome to the chat, is that this is interactive and this is meant to be a conversation around food safety. And I don't know about our guest, Duncan, or you perhaps, but one of the things I never really like is being lectured to. And you have to do things this way. And this is, I've always kind of tended to rebel against those type of outputs. And so this is definitely not what we're doing here. This is meant to be interactive and hopefully a good use of your Friday morning or afternoon if you're in the UK. So first off, before we get started, let's do this. I gotta do the paper thing. It's like David Letterman. Okay, are you ready, Duncan? Are you ready for the dad joke?
I have braced myself.
Today's a bit of trivia. This is an interesting one. I was very surprised when I came across this. So, do you know if can a frog jump higher than a house?
Well, I don't know. Can a frog jump higher than a house?
Well, of course it can. A house cannot jump.
Oh, Bryan! No. Be ashamed.
Corin is like, what the hell did I just join? What is this?
I thought we were here to discuss food
Ivana,
safety.
nice to see you again. Yeah, I like that one. That one struck my fancy. So that was a good dad joke. So we got a ton to go here, so we're going to keep this thing going. Next up on our chat here this morning, Duncan, is of course our ceremonial drink. So please, everyone, grab your favorite beverage and join us for a toast. Cheers. Very good, very good. What are you drinking this morning, Duncan? Or afternoon, sorry.
That is Vimto Citrus.
Nice. Hopefully full of vitamins.
Well, I'm sure there's all sorts of stuff in there.
So to get started here, anybody who's been on the chat here regularly knows that Duncan is not only a guest on the chat, he's also a very good contributor on the chat, always bringing very cogent responses and inquiries and additional value as part of the chat. So thank you for investing the time in that. I know that everybody here appreciates it greatly. So one of the things I kind of wanted to mention as well too is Food Industry Hub. This is an amazing resource, and at the end we'll put the link in here as well. But I wanted here at the beginning too, for new people here in the chat who may not be familiar with your resource, what is Food Industry Hub and what do you do on that site?
I've actually been spending a lot of time recently thinking about what Food Industry Hub is, and I think if I said that Food Industry Hub has a software product associated with it, everybody understands about software providers and how they fit in the food industry. But Food Industry Hub is far more than that. And the mission is to use digital services in any form to relay value to the food industry. And we want to enrich not just food manufacturing businesses, but also professionals working in the food industry. And it's just become quite vast at this point. And so there's a signposting service for every major resource provider throughout the food industry. There's an enormous blog. There's a knowledge library that connects you to every industry term and jargon. We've got unit converters, an infinite Julian date calendar. It's just so worthwhile to explore. Get onto the Food Industry Hub website and just have a click around. There's a lot of it going on.
Nice. And yeah, that's a ton of value on there. And so definitely with that website, definitely check it out. There's lots to see there for sure. Wow, our international guests are filing in. So South Africa, London. Wow, amazing. So let's dive in here, Duncan. So one of the things here on the chat that I reference quite a bit, and I'm a big advocate of this, is that the basics sometimes in quality, we skip over the basics because we just assume that everyone understands them and that everybody knows how to use them. And that is definitely not the case. You can't graduate to Six Sigma and start analyzing CPKs and all the different type of statistical tools you can use in that range until you understand the basics. And here in the U.S., there's a famous analogy. There was a very famous college basketball coach in the late 60s and 70s who just had an incredible winning streak at the University of California, Los Angeles, named John Wooden. And a lot of very well-known, prestigious athletes came out of that program to become very successful professional players, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and other players, for example. And he would always famously start off his practices with the basics. And imagine this, world tier college athletes who were just amazing at what they did. He would start off those practices and he would pick up a basketball and he would say, "This is a basketball. now let's practice dribbling. And they would work on basics. And it's very tempting and it's very glamorous sometimes, Duncan, to think, oh I understand all that stuff. I want to go to the more sophisticated stuff. That's a big mistake. So kind of what we're going to be talking about here today is what we're doing for plan, do, check, act. And what are those processes with that? And importantly, I think a big piece of this as well is how do you communicate these principles relative to plan, do, check, act into the different aspects of what we do in our jobs? So as Jose Sabal has done an excellent job of training me, is always start with the basic level of information and start with an understanding that's common to all. So with that, Duncan, what is plan, do, check, act to you? What does that process mean to you?
So before answering the question, I'll just clarify for anyone who's not encountered this, because we do really need to take a step back and start at the beginning. Yeah. So plan, do, check, act is just a sequential approach to management, and you make a plan of what you intend to do. You do, so you carry out that action. You check to see what the results of the action were and whether they align with your original intention. And then you take action to recalibrate and adjust based on the feedback and information gathered during the doing stage. And I think with that out the way I think about it is that plan, do, check, act is no better or worse than any other management approach. I'm not a diehard advocate for plan, do, check, act compared to things like Kaizen and Six Sigma or anything that you could take your pick if you like. But the thing about plan, do, check, act is if you compare it to a negative feedback loop, so negative feedback loop, let's say you put the thermostat of the central heating on your house at 20 degrees, then the temperature drops to 19, the temperature sensor picks up that variance, and in response, the central heating turns on until such a time as 20 degrees is reached, and then it turns off again. And it's sort of a constant on-off cycle intended to maintain the desired conditions. So that's kind of a engineering application of plan, do, check, act designed to remain static in a state. And with food safety and quality, we don't want to remain static. We want to pursue continuous improvement. So plan, do, check, act is more dynamic and it evolves an approach. So you can say that we make a plan to achieve safe, legal food of desired quality, and we take action in alignment with that plan that we made. And as we're doing it, we're making records, gathering information, carrying out review, feeding information back into the system so that there can be managerial adjustments. And then based on the information that we transmit back into management, there's a responsive process of taking new, fresh decisions, so that we can continually move forward in a better and stronger way.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, as we're thinking about this, another real world analogy for me is driving a car. Right? Is you don't sit in your car and just simply grab the wheel and then you just go straight. You're constantly, when you're driving a car, measuring the variables, looking for changes in the environment, scanning for variables in your system that you need to take into consideration, and all of that with the goal of avoiding the wreck. And that's what we're shooting for when we're putting all these different programs together, is really what you're doing. And PDCA, and to your point, these are all tools in the toolbox, just like Six Sigma and Kaizen and all these other things. These all are interrelated and they all work together. And plan, do, check, act is very closely tied to CAPA. So corrective action and process. When you're looking at these type of programs and course correcting, I think is probably the simplest way to say it, right? You're doing this all the time. And in lots of ways, in what we do in food safety and quality, that's what we are. We're detectives, and we're testing the system, and we're evaluating the system. We're asking questions and seeing if we're getting the expected result that we wanted from what we were asking for. And if not, we just can't shrug our shoulders and say, oh, well, better luck next time. We have to figure out why. And I think that's why plan, do, check, act is I reference so much, is it's one of those things that's easy to forget, but is absolutely critical to your business.
Which I still slightly picking up on that, by the way. If you look at things like Kaizen and Six Sigma, the practical application of Kaizen and Six Sigma, they use the same techniques, right? So the only differentiating factor is Kaizen is built around incremental, everyday improvement, taking small steps, in real time, and it's very dynamic and rooted in shop floor development. Whereas Six Sigma is a bit more along the lines of statistical process control and variance reduction. But the actual techniques used in service of either of those approaches are the same techniques. It's all lean manufacturing and corrective and preventative actions, root cause analysis. There's no difference in the tools that you use to carry out those managerial approaches. And recently I did a review of all of the different quality management systems, so Kaizen and Six Sigma and so forth. And the outcome of this seems to be all roads lead to total quality management. So if you look into any one of these, they're only very slightly differentiated in their overarching objective and philosophy, but they're not particularly differentiated in the practical application.
Good observation. I like that. Ahmed, good morning to you, and Austin, good to see you. So one of the things, we had a fascinating conversation when we were preparing for this chat earlier in the week, and something that really caught my attention that you were talking about was there's 3 levels in a decision hierarchy. How this process actually works. What are those 3 different levels you were talking about?
So for Plan, Do, Check, Act taken at any stage of magnification, either operations within a food business or right up to supply chain level, you've always got 3 agents or 3 operators that interact, and that's decision maker, implementer, and verifier. So if we look at operations level within a department in a food manufacturing business, decision maker is department manager, implementer would be operator, technician, and verifier would be supervisor or quality assurance technician. And those 3 components, or those 3 interactive agents, interact together to carry out the Plan, Do, Check, Act process. But this applies at any level of magnification. So if you go up to supply chain level, you might have decision maker in the form of the GFSI benchmarked assurance scheme certification bodies. Then implementer would be food manufacturing businesses, and then verifier would be auditing bodies. And again, it doesn't matter what level of magnification you look at. So the auditor that carries out audits on behalf of the auditing bodies, the decision makers are still the certification bodies, and in part the auditing bodies, in that the auditor receives instructions from them. And then the implementer is the individual auditor, and the verifier is through functions like shadow audits and auditor competency challenge. And I can go on giving more and more examples, but it doesn't matter what magnification along the supply chain you look at. There's always 3 individual components to a Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle. So decision maker is the planning, implementer do, verifier checks and acts to send information back up to the decision maker, and that's how the cycle continues. And that's been sort of playing on my mind a little bit, because every time we see one of these major high profile supply chain disruptions, or there's a food recall incident, something like that, and there's a lot of commentary about how the auditing system has failed, or the GFSI benchmarked assurance systems have let us down again. And I'm thinking, that's only one component within a complex pattern. But when you're looking at interconnected systems at different levels of magnification, not only at operations level within a food business, but also right up at supply chain level, there's a huge, you should think about it in economic terms. So you should think in systems think and apply the same level of analysis and prediction as you would do if you were an economist and you were trying to think about, well, what would be the effect if we rose interest levels, or what would be the effect if there was a trade embargo or something like that, and you try to analyze all of the different actors within that complex system. When we look at the food system globally, it's kind of very reductive to look at any failure at any point and say, well, the certification bodies have let us down yet again, because there's quite a lot more complexity that goes into the global food system than that.
And that's an important part of what we're talking about here, is really this feedback loop, no matter the system that you're looking at, is dependent upon people to execute those instructions. And this whole feedback mechanism is meant to make sure that at that highest level, so your decision maker, so the manager, the director, whoever is determining the course of action that needs to take place, a lot of times that information gets lost in translation once it's actually put out into practice. And so let's say you're the manager and I'm working for you, Duncan, and you have some instructions you want me to follow out. Well, I go out and do those, but there may be interpretation, or there may be things that I assume that you're thinking. I'm trying to read your mind, and I've falsely done that, and I'm creating a task that's not correct according to the intent of what you wanted me to do. That check piece is to go back and make sure that, oh, okay, well, here's what we wanted to do. How are we doing? Let's look at the information. Let's look at the data. Are we going the direction that this was intended to take us? Yes or no? And to your point, which I think is a really good one, I want to reemphasize that, is, let's say in that particular example, I am not executing it to the intention of what you are wanting. The incorrect response is bad Bryan, right? Shame on you. You have not followed my directions, and I'm going to write you up, and bad employee. That's the incorrect approach. It's like, okay, well, this didn't go according to plan. How do I correct this to get this back onto course? What actions do we need to take to modify this process? I think, Duncan, a really good example of this that we see in production facilities is good manufacturing practices, right? Is, let's say something like hairnets, right? What is the proper way to wear a hairnet? A lot of people have different opinions on that, don't they?
and it's a bit of a fashion accessory, isn't it? It sits above your ears.
Yeah, and it keeps doing this.
but in the situation that you outlined, you kind of go to pains to describe how it comes about as a misunderstanding in the reception of instructions. So you're alluding already to, you've got a root cause analysis that one out, because it would be sort of knee jerk to say bad Bryan. I mean, you still could be bad Bryan, but we don't know that until we've done the root cause analysis. But it could be a defect in the way the instructions are given, could be a defect in the way the instructions are received. It could be a defect in the motivation of the person who's receiving the instruction, in that there's a conflict of interest because you've asked them to do something that conflicts with one of their other values or ideals. But on a very sort of small scale, this kind of comes right down to the granular level of operations. We're not even talking about a departmental function. We're talking about the delivery of instructions from one individual to another. But the same pattern will apply at any scale of magnification.
Right. Well, and I think, and this highlights another important thing, and I talk about this in my book a lot on the quality system piece, is no document, no instruction in and of itself provides the necessary information that's going to come up in any scenario. And it's folly to try and do that. I've had issues in my past. We'll stick on the GMP issue again. I remember I worked at a company and we had a good manufacturing process procedure for the facility. And this document, Duncan, was, I think it was around 35 pages long of all of the information that were required for GMPs. And when I had arrived in the company, it was a game at that point to see how far you could test that system. And so a potential loophole in the GMPs would be identified to workers on the floor who would then exploit that. Well, then the quality manager would write more information into the GMPs to try and close that perceived gap, and then the game would start over again. What was missing with that? What was missing was the intent. It's like, okay, guys, why do we wear hairnets? For a fashion statement? No, of course not. We're wearing hairnets for an extremely vital purpose. Do you like finding hair in your food, right? Ew, God, no. Hair, right? Everybody would freak out. And that's right. Now, extrapolate to everybody else, right? We are making food for people, and we absolutely have to keep hair and foreign material out of our food. And that's why we have these rules in place. It's not for fun. It's because it's important to make sure that we have happy customers. Because if we don't have happy customers, we're all out of jobs. And the whole point with that whole exposition is the why. So training is as important as the documentation and the processes itself. The managing director, the decision maker who is creating that process, needs to take the time to train and provide the context associated with that process. Would you agree with that?
So training is no more or less important than any other part of this interconnected system. Yes. But if you've got this plan, do, check, act approach, then if you don't originally have the training and competence required to make a solid plan, then there's a deficit. And if you instruct people to carry out the plan that you made and they aren't trained and competent and able to be able to apply what you've asked them to do, then it doesn't go anywhere. But I think that training is equally important to compliance, or that attitude of, yes, I will conform to the instructions received. Training is equally important to the quality of input information that steers a decision. So I wouldn't put training elevated in importance compared to anything else. It's simply that the cycle depends on pardon me, interconnected inputs, and it's got to be dynamic and circular in nature. I know it's off on a little bit of a tangent, so I'll apologize for that. But another thing I was doing quite recently is I've reviewed all of the BRCGS food standard and looked at information flow throughout operations back into management. And there was a number of occasions. So if you've got complaints data, or if you've got a major incident, or if you've got a failure of the site to fulfill its KPIs and objectives, there's documented, structured requirements for that data to be transmitted into the senior management team in time for their senior management review meetings. At the same time, where you have your internal audits, any outcomes from internal audits, or non-conformances raised, and if you've got customer complaints and that sort of stuff, that information is used to validate the HACCP system, right? So you think about the HACCP system as undergoing this once a year validation, but it needs to be live and dynamic. So if you look at information flow within the operations of a food business, there's a very intentional system of data transmission, and you can look at it as plan, do, check, act on operational scale. But that's sort of no more or less important than any other scale that you could look at. So if you look at it on a granular level of an individual contributor carrying out their individual tasks on the shop floor, right through to supply chain level, and you look at regulators and lawmakers and enforcement agencies as they interact with the food industry and food supply chain operators. It should all be taken as an interconnected, complex system, with no single component being more or less important than anything else.
Yeah. Well, and I think that complexity, Duncan, is very daunting. People tend to want to then back up, right, and get this big picture view of things. And it's just like, this is so complex. I'm overwhelmed. I don't know where to start. But if you start breaking it down into these components and looking at it from the standpoint of your viewpoint on this, which I think is a really good way to look at this, is the decision maker, implementer, verifier. Who are the three key players in this process? Can I identify them? That's number one. Let's say, for example, that you're looking at a process and you identify a process that involves two decision makers, and they're approaching something from two different perspectives. Let's say a process where you have the head of quality and the head of procurement who are looking at designing a process, and they're approaching it from different perspectives. Well, that may not be the best way to do it, because then you're going to have potential confusion between what you're trying to get out of that process. Does that make sense?
It does, and that's just a defect of management. So I was working at a food manufacturing business at one point, and production manager came to me and said, "We've got this risk that's developed on the shop floor," and I was like, "Oh, well, in that case, we need to stop at this point, and we need to, investigate the severity of risk and make sure that it's properly managed." And production manager says, you do realize that means stopping production, and we'll have all of these operators. And I'm sort of, I'm fairly dispassionate on that point. I'm an advocate for quality and safety. Yeah. So in this instance, maybe what we need to do is, wander over to the operations director and allow him to arbitrate that decision and weigh the different considerations against each other, so that we sort of go up a pay grade in the decision-making level. Because if you've got two representatives of two separate functions within a business, I'm not about to sit here and say either one of those functions is superior or more important to the other. I'm saying that you've got to have a representative of the management team whose task it is to weigh those considerations against each other in service of the objectives of the overall business.
Yes. And so I refer to that as, there's a shorthand saying I use for that, Duncan, which is the organization solves all. What do I mean by that? So for example, there was a process I was looking at in the company I was at in my past. And so I was running quality, and I wasn't seeing eye to eye with the head of marketing. And we were looking at some label claims or whatever the potential issue was that we were looking at. And we weren't getting anywhere because we had different goals associated with this process as decision makers. And I was in the office of the chief legal counsel complaining about how this person didn't know, blah, blah, blah. Just looking at it strictly from my viewpoint. And he sat back and said, Bryan, you need to look at this differently. The organization solves all. And it took me aback. And I kind of had to sit there and, okay, well, explain that to me, please. And he said, okay, you have a peer and you're trying to reach a decision, to your example, Duncan, and you're not seeing things eye to eye and you're having a disagreement. Elevate, take that to your boss, and your counterpart does the same. If they don't agree, that process repeats. Eventually it gets to the CEO. The CEO then makes a decision. Problem solved. Right? The organization will figure this out. Don't take it personally. And that was a key learning for me at that point in time, because I viewed, and a lot of times in quality, we have this perspective, which I need to force my view of this is right, and we need to do this on everyone else in the organization in our function. And all you're going to get when you do that is pushback, because that's human nature. People are going to push back if you do that.
Well, it's also, I'm not going to say empowering, because whatever point you occupy in the organizational chart, you have to operate within the scope of your role.
Yeah.
But if you say it's sort of empowering is not quite the word, but there's something that brings peace when you acknowledge the scope of your own position. It allows you to fully and diligently service the role that you occupy. But another thing that I grappled with years ago is it's exactly as important to escalate upwards to management as it is to delegate downwards as a manager. And
Yes.
let's say you're a quality assurance operator and you're doing a GMP audit on the shop floor, and you find that there's a big risk that's emerged, right? It's not your job to kind of halt operations or impose a certain action, but it absolutely is your job to inform the decision makers above you and make sure that the situation is appropriately managed in a timely and responsive way. And that it's kind of two directional. So everybody, it's so tempting to think about management as being top down, but if you stop thinking about impositional management and start thinking more about dynamic information flow across different tiers within an organization or across a supply chain, then information sent upwards for managerial consideration is exactly as valid as any instructions that are delegated downwards. But the instructions and the delegation process is dependent on that information flow.
No, I completely agree. And so as a point of clarification on that as well, is your job as a manager in a particular role relative to what we're talking about here today is to solve problems. That's why you're there. No one's going to like it if you just kick your problems to someone else either, right? If you're constantly going to your boss and saying, I need this fixed, help me, and you have no solutions or no avenues of approach, and you're taking things that shouldn't be elevated, that's not a good thing either, right? You have to understand your roles and responsibilities within the company for navigating all of this information. Another good point that I want to bring up here as well too, for good processes within this, is it's very tempting. I'll be curious to get your thoughts on this, Duncan. It's very tempting when we're creating these processes and we're functioning in the role of the decision maker and saying, we need to create a procedure for this activity. It's very tempting to simply document that process as it works all the time, right? So what do I mean by that? I mean, all right, here's how this process works, step 1 through 20, when it's functioning as it should. Well, we know very well in what we do that is not always the case. More than not, it's not the case. So in receiving, shipments show up and the seal is missing on the back of the truck, or the documentation is incorrect, or you open the truck and a skunk jumps out the back of the truck, what have you. It's just as important too to evaluate those processes and essentially gameplay them out and work with the people who are doing that process. Don't sit in your office and do this. Go out and talk with them and find out the things that can go wrong with that process and build that in as well and say, okay, if this occurs, what action should we be taking to help bring this back? Plan, do, check, act to that actual process itself. What are your thoughts around that?
I laugh because it sounds a little bit like you have your standard operating procedures and then non-standard operating procedures. But the way I've encountered these sorts of things is you have your procedural standard, or that you train out and it's all documented, and that's the instruction manual for how to carry out a task, and hopefully you're following that sort of 80 or 90% of the time. And then you've got deviations, and they fall into two categories. So some of the deviations are easily foreseeable because they happen with some regularity. And with that, I mean, think about if you're operating a metal detector and you're doing your hourly check box and the metal detector fails to reject a test piece, right? You know, if you're just operating the procedure, then it's all done on the assumption that the metal detector will successfully reject its test pieces. And but that's the reason that we have a decision tree and corrective and preventative actions to be taken in the event of a loss of control. And that's kind of one of the nice relevant applications of the HACCP system is when you're determining your CCPs. You don't just create a system for how to operate the CCP under good controlled conditions. You also demand that the HACCP team has predefined what to do in the event of a loss of control. So that's a deviation that you're able to foresee and plan for. And then the other one is the unforeseeable deviations that no one saw coming. And that's pretty much where you're hoping that because the documented management system couldn't adequately account for that scenario, your food safety and quality culture will be robust enough that people undertake appropriate actions in the spirit of the food safety and quality management system to contain risk and make sure that the situation's appropriately handled. Now, when I say appropriately handled, you know, you can't define in advance what your expectations for appropriately are, but that's got to be the fallback.
Yeah, and this is a perfect example of you need to train your people that if this unforeseeable situation arises, what do? Right? Do you just simply shrug and continue operating because no one told you what to do? No, you need to elevate, and you need to talk with your supervisor, who then talks with the manager and up the chain. It's like Austin talks about here in the chat is, you know, speak up culture of, okay. And as the quality manager in the facility, if something like this is found, you should be glad because now you've identified something that needs to be added into your processes. You've now found an unknown variable in that. And now you need to think about, okay, well, how do we now incorporate this knowledge in? Back to your metal detector example, I was thinking about this is, why are we doing this, right? The metal detector is there to make sure that metal doesn't get in the product and we find it and we don't get it out in the marketplace. If we have in that procedure that, oh, okay, well, we're going to check the metal detector every hour. And sure enough, the operator checks that metal detector every hour and the wands are working fine. But every hour they're having a hit on the metal detector and they don't do anything about it. You've circumvented the entire system, the entire reason for that system being there. It's like, yep, we're finding metal every hour. The metal detector's working. Okay, yeah. But that's not why it's there, right? It's not there. It's strictly for that reason. It's the why behind those things. And communicating that becomes really, really important. And identifying trends and all those type of things that we talk about with a good process. So with this, and I think a lot of times too, this references back, Duncan, you know, more on the philosophical side of how we're doing things and those conflicts between different department heads that can arise. To your point earlier, everybody's there for a reason. Everybody has a purpose. Procurement, operations, HR, everyone in that facility has a reason to be there, and they're contributing to producing that product and getting a good product out the door that's safe, wholesome, and all the good things that we expect from our products. Really, I think a lot of times, sometimes, and this is key with senior leadership in the facility or even in the company, of communicating that information downstream. I'm very curious to get your thoughts around. A lot of times you'll have vision statements or mission statements for companies, or KPI objectives that the board of directors has issued that are very high, floating up in the ether. And a lot of times companies struggle translating that down into the facility at the manager, supervisor, operator level on what is expected, because it's just too vague. How do you address those type of things? What have you seen relative to this 3-step process?
So in the food industry, many of the companies that I've been exposed to have not obviously had a mission statement, which, to me seems like crazy town now sitting in this position. But the way it's actually manifested is for sites that operate to the BRCGS food standard. It says you've got to have a policy that states the site's intention to meet its obligation to produce safe, legal food of the desired quality, and you must safeguard the authenticity of the food. Right? So in terms of mission and vision and stuff, they don't tend to be particularly visible, and the sort of nod to this effect is through the policy, and those sorts of policies get well displayed throughout everywhere that you might go. So if you look at signs and notice boards and displays and at reception and at the entrance to the factory, you're going to see this policy over and over again. So it's the Bagel Corp. It commits to producing safe, legal bagels of the desired quality, that sort of stuff. Right. And the gripe that I have with it is it doesn't tend to be very much more than a statement of "we will do," as if written on a carbon copy. It's sort of boilerplate legal sort of, the compliance standard says you have to have a policy that says this, so we've got a policy that says this. And the way it's, I think the relevancy for that kind of policy sort of starts and stops with the notice board. But if you look at reporting systems and metrics that get actually scrutinized, every day there could be a shop floor huddle, and manager turns up with a clipboard and is going, okay, what's our output to the hour? What's overall equipment effectiveness? What's our downtime figures? What's our, and it's very much about output, and this is a manufacturing environment. And then you've got these monthly performance KPIs that might get transmitted up to C-suite, and the entire KPI document, if you read it all, it's talking about the same things. So it's kind of overall equipment effectiveness, and what's our downtime figure for the month, and how productive, what's our productive output relative to customer order requirements and that kind of stuff. And then at the bottom of the KPI sheet, it will say things like, did we get any interesting customer complaints this month? Which is, a way of incorporating quality performance.
Yeah.
But I think, the phrase, what gets measured gets managed.
Yeah.
One of my standpoints is, if you're the manager and the question that you ask to people over and over and over is, what's output? What's overall equipment effectiveness? What efficiency are we running at? Right? The person receiving the question is very correctly going to identify what's important to you. Right? But conversely, if you were the manager and you're entering into the operations team, and you say things like, well, what's our percentage conformity to the QAS for the product, right? What's our what's our failure rate on a metal detector? All of this kind of, if you were really interested in quality and safety and authenticity, because those were actually important on an operational basis, then there would be targeted questions around that, right? And you might say things like, not just what was the pass rate on a product from the taste panel for yesterday's shift, right? You might actually ask questions like, how many people voluntarily attended the taste panel, right? That kind of thing. Right. So I'm saying that there are objective questions that you can pursue that would lead you down a path that would express managerial priorities. But the actual questions that you really see getting asked every hour on the hour well, what's downtime and what's overall equipment effectiveness and what's output, and kind of stuff. So,
Right.
so I think
Well,
there's something of a disconnect.
yeah, absolutely. And so Cortland made a good comment here, right? And this is kind of the function of management review. And so for me, there's a couple of watch outs here in this, is that yes, company mission statements and other abstract statements are there in a lot of ways to give information to the market and potential investors on how awesome they are. But it's critical with the management team at that facility, and we'll keep this at the plant level, to sit down and say, well, what does this mean to us? How do we use measures within our operations to see if we're hitting this target or not? Because you've hit on something important that I want to make sure to emphasize with everyone, is that sometimes we get too inwardly focused, and we're looking at all of these measures, and we have to be very careful. So to your point, Duncan, let's say that the plant manager in the facility is very big on pounds per man hour production, and she is constantly hitting on us in the plant that we need to increase our efficiency. We need to produce more pounds, and that's the only message. In that extreme example that I'm giving right now, everyone in the plant then says, oh, okay, our goal is to get out as much product as possible, right? And corners start getting cut, substandard product is being shipped, because the objective is to ship product. We didn't say how good the product is. She just said ship product. And you're going to find out very quickly that that goal is inappropriate in that context. A lot of times, and my point with that is, be very careful not to get too inwardly focused. Don't forget, to our comments earlier, who are you doing this for, and what do they expect? The kind of the analysis I use on this is within the R&D function and product development, we have all these different metrics that we're looking at for the product: pH, titratable acidity, color, texture, you name it. What does the consumer care? I never had a complaint back from a consumer saying, I drank this beverage that you produce, and I think your pH is a little too low and it's out of spec. No, right? They're going to say, I bought your product and it tastes terrible. What did you do to it? They have that internal benchmark, and you need to understand what that is.
As you were speaking, by the way, I'm reminded, Rory Sutherland's got this story to tell about in communism, they weren't allowed to brand products. So you'd get rivets produced at a number of different factories. And because none of the factories could brand their individual outputted rivet products, the incentive system turned against quality and in favor of production output, and so they started using worse and worse quality metals to produce the rivets, and they were all taken to a big consolidating warehouse, and so it was never possible to identify who'd produced the things. So when you take away if you take away that incentive and you say things are now aligned for nothing but output and the quality is sort of it's actually irrelevant, then you guarantee that quality will deteriorate as an output come of that. And on the just on the subject of the mission and vision and all of this sort of thing, I can't remember the exact circumstances, but in the early days of Google, they had this imperative, which was simply worded, "Don't be evil."
Right.
And there's a story that goes around where there was a bunch of guys in the canteen at lunchtime, and they're all working on projects and stuff. And then somebody says something a bit sketchy about how data will be used. And somebody stands up and says, no, we said right from the beginning, we're not going to be evil. And that sounds like we're straying into evil territory to me. And if you've got a mission and a vision that clearly it doesn't actually need to be very descriptive, but if you've got a clear line in the sand that people can understand, then actions will be taken around that kind of value system. And same thing, by the way, with Jeff Bezos and Amazon. He's got this dictum that every decision that's taken within the business should be done in service of customer satisfaction through speed of delivery, low prices, high quality. And for any meeting that they're having managerially, if somebody proposes a new project or a new action to be taken, it can simply be met with the line of questioning, well, would that improve customer experience, or would it make things faster or better or cheaper? Because if it doesn't, then nice idea, but let's not, sort of thing. And I think if there was I'd like to think that if that kind of stance were more embraced around values, then there would be potentially a breakthrough. So there would be some value to be gleaned from, look, when we got into the bagel business, we said we were going to make the best bagels on the market. And are we doing that? Right. And that's a useful question to ask.
Yeah. What does that mean? What does best mean? So yeah, one final comment on that, and then we're getting short on time here, is so in a past company I worked at, the CEO had a fantastic saying around that, which stuck with me, is we want to be easy to do business with. Brilliant. And it worked upstream and downstream. I remember I was in a meeting with the accounting group, and he was in this meeting with us. And the accounting group was proposing new processes to extend the terms and payments for the vendors. And we would have all this additional cash flow that would free up within the business. And we would, stretch the terms out as long as possible for those suppliers. And this would be beneficial for us. And the CEO said, does that make us easy to do business with? And the accounting group was like, what? It's like, if I'm the supplier, I'm going to be very upset with you, right? You're not paying me. I have payroll to meet on my side. I'm being very difficult to deal with. Is that a good partnership? Well, no. Okay, well then let's not do it. Brilliant. I loved that saying. So let's kind of bring this back up to the 30,000 foot level, please, Duncan. And wow, fantastic comments, everybody, guys. And I know we wanted to get more. I saw your comment, Corin, on nonconformist procedures. That would be a very good topic. Maybe we'll deal in on that separately, because that's a huge one on nonconformances and if this process doesn't work. So we'll definitely look at that here for a future chat. But so as we're kind of closing this out here, Duncan, what would you like to leave people with today from our chat here?
So I suppose the overall global food supply system is complex enough that if something goes wrong, it probably doesn't have a clear and obvious point of blame. So when we're looking at the mission to improve and strengthen quality assurance and safety and authenticity and legality across the entire food system, if you find yourself inclined to make statements like, that one system of control let us down yet again, that's probably in error. There's probably more nuance to look at. And in terms of non-conformance and root cause analysis and corrective and preventative actions and that plan, do, check, act cycle, you can actually scrutinize that on several different levels of magnification, be it granular right down at individual contributor level through to food business operations and upwards to supply chain and regulatory bodies and enforcement agencies. And there's a lot of intersection and interaction with different components of that system, and it's dynamic in real time. But I find it interesting that where you have decision makers at multiple different points of magnification across the system, there isn't any one individual or organization who is accountable for the overall system working. So that is perhaps something to bear in mind. There is no one individual or organization who is accountable for the effectiveness of quality assurance and safety across the global food supply system.
Yeah. Nice way to sum it up. I like that. So with that, guys, fantastic chat today. And as promised, here in the chat, I'll put, so here is the Food Industry Hub website. If you haven't been there, Duncan and his team, fantastic resource, incredible information, and it's done in the spirit of what we're doing here. which is we're all in this together, right? Food safety is not a point of competition. We're all working in this, and best practices benefit everyone. So to your example with, how you're looking at the frame relative to this for decision maker, implementer, and verifier, right? That applies for food safety overall as an industry too. So you can zoom out or focus in on this concept as much as you want. And I think that's what makes it so valuable. So thank you, Duncan, for all that you're doing out there to help food safety and contribute, and coming here on the chat and answering people's questions. And thank you to everybody who joined us. It's always great to see these wonderful faces and my friends within the industry that we've built these communities with. And we appreciate all that you do as well. And all of your inputs here, very good communications, and I love it. So with that, one of the questions that we had here from Ahmed is, how often is the chat? Well, my friend, here how often the chat is. We are live every Friday at 8 a.m. Mountain Time, 10 a.m. Eastern here in the US, where we live stream on LinkedIn and YouTube. And at this time, I bring on an amazing guest like Duncan, and we'll do it again next week, where we'll talk again about another food safety topic. So everybody, you've done a great job this week. We love all that you do, and we thank you for doing it. But in the meantime, enjoy the weekend. Have a good time, relax, recharge, and we'll do it all again next week. So thank you again, Duncan. Thanks, everybody. Have a great one. We'll see you back here next week.
And if we're still live, definitely do have a look at the website. You're not going to regret that. So much resource on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I look at it all the time. So, all right. See everybody next week.